wind that carried the February frost also carried with it a letter that had no business existing. Miss Marple, seated beside her lace-curtained window in St. Mary Mead, noticed it not for its color or weight, but for the scent it carried, lavender and old soot, the kind that lingers in unopened cupboards and beneath folded church vestments. It arrived without a stamp, without a sender, simply addressed to her by hand. Inside, a single sheet of rough stationery, bearing only a dozen words. The church keeps a name it never spoke. Ask a Candlemas. No signature. No clue. Just the weight of something long buried. That Sunday, Miss Marple found herself on the edge of Chipping Dean, a village too modest to be noticed on most maps, but old enough to remember things that had been forgotten elsewhere. She entered the chapel of St. Simon's during the last rays of dusk, just as preparations for the Candlemas service were underway. The scent of beeswax hung in the air, and brass candlesticks shone with that peculiar gleam only achieved by hands that polish while keeping secrets. Reverend Pritchard greeted her with genuine warmth, if a trace of fatigue. "We're just setting the sanctuary candles," he explained. "A simple service, really. Not many remember Candlemas these days." But Miss Marple remembered. She remembered what Candlemas used to signify, not just a Christian celebration of light, but an older rite of dedication, of firstborns, of promises made in stone and sealed in silence. She asked to sit for a moment in the pews. The chapel was quiet, apart from the careful footsteps of Mrs. Dunning, the housekeeper and parish record-keeper, who was arranging hymnals and smoothing linens with the same exacting touch she might use to smooth away history. Miss Marple watched the way her hand trembled when she passed a certain pew, the third on the left. Nothing unusual about it, not at first glance. But when Miss Marple traced the edge of the wood with her glove, she felt a small groove, an old carving, initials long worn by time. Read. That night, back in her guest room at the vicarage, Miss Marple couldn't sleep. She sat in her dressing gown with a shawl around her shoulders, staring at the envelope again. Who knew to send it? And why now, after so many years? Below the window, the candle in the chapel flickered in the dark. And she remembered something. During Candlemas, some churches once lit the sanctuary candle, not just for Christ's blessing, but in memory of the first child ever named within their walls. In the margins of history, Miss Marple had always found the truth, not in records, not in declarations, but in what people tried hardest to erase. And this village, she now sensed, was not hiding a murder. It was hiding a name that once belonged to someone who should have mattered. And so, before the frost thawed and the candles dimmed, Miss Marple resolved she would uncover that name, whatever it cost. Because truth, she had learned, didn't need shouting. It only needed someone willing to listen to silence. Morning brought a thin veil of mist over Chipping Dean, softening the stone outlines of roofs and fences, but sharpening something far more delicate in Miss Marple's mind: suspicion. She awoke before the chapel bell and sat quietly in the guest room's window seat, watching the garden frost glint like old lace. Below, she could see the chapel doors ajar. A rare sight. Either someone had forgotten to lock them, or someone had reason to return. By 8:30, she had taken her tea and made her way to the vicarage study under the pretense of offering help with Sunday school rosters. Reverend Pritchard, ever gracious and a bit absent-minded, led her toward a narrow cupboard behind the desk. "The parish books are in here," he explained, "though most haven't been touched in decades. Candlemas isn't really a priority in most records." But it was in forgotten corners. Miss Marple often reminded herself that truth tends to linger. She sifted gently through the ledgers, brittle bindings, faded ink, baptisms, deaths, marriages. Yet something struck her almost at once. The years between 1910 and 1912 had been rebound. Not torn, not burned, but recopied, neatly, deliberately. On a hunch, she checked the initials at the bottom of each re-recorded page. The same looping handwriting, the same hand as the envelope. Mrs. Dunning. She closed the book carefully and looked toward the chapel through the study window. The candle still burned on the altar, though no one had yet lit the others. That flame, steady in its glass, was meant to stand for Christ's presence, but today it felt like something else. A witness, perhaps. Later, under the pretext of needing more sugar, Miss Marple stopped by the vicarage kitchen where Mrs. Dunning folded linens, with calm precision. "You've been here a long while," Miss Marple said conversationally. Mrs. Dunning didn't look up. 32 years, this March." "Then you must know the records better than anyone." The older woman hesitated, only slightly, but enough. "Well, some things don't need remembering," she said softly. "They only need tidying away." Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. "I find," she said, "that untidied truths have a habit of surfacing, usually when it's least convenient." That afternoon, Miss Marple took a quiet walk to the village library, now housed in a converted schoolhouse. Miss Evely, the librarian, greeted her with the nervous delight reserved for polite strangers with purpose. "I wonder," Miss Marple said, "if you have any parish pamphlets from 1910? Or perhaps even Candlemas sermon notes. Some churches printed them back then." Miss Evely blinked. "There's an old donation box of church ephemera in the storeroom. Hasn't been touched in ages." What they found wasn't much: stiff sermon tracts, a 1909 prayer bulletin, and at the bottom, a folded leaflet, dedication of the firstborn, Feast of Candlemas, 1911. The last page bore a single handwritten name in the corner, faint but legible: Richard Edward Drake, and beneath it, a second name, scrawled in smaller ink: Mother Isolde unwed. No surname, no blessing, no ceremony. Miss Marple ran her fingers along the margin. It was a child's name, whispered once, then locked away. It wasn't in the official ledgers, because someone had removed it. But they hadn't found every trace. She looked up at Miss Evely. "Would you mind if I borrowed this for the evening?" The librarian nodded. "Of course. It's not on record. No one's ever asked for it. But someone would. Because now, Miss Marple understood the letter's meaning. The church keeps a name it never spoke. And tonight, she would ask it to speak." The wind that evening blew with a restless hush, as though the village itself strained to overhear secrets not yet said aloud. Miss Marple returned to her small guest room, placed the borrowed Candlemas leaflet on her writing desk, and lit the stub of beeswax she always carried in her travel case. She preferred it to electric light when deep thought was required. It had a softer truth to it. The paper's edges curled slightly under the flickering warmth, but the ink remained clear. Richard Edward Drake, Mother Isolde, a name forgotten by time, but remembered now by the walls of the vicarage and the corners of the archive. Miss Marple opened her small notebook and jotted down the constellation of connections now beginning to surface. Richard Clayole, an orphan curate with no known family, had come here only 6 months ago. He'd claimed to have studied Candlemas as a theological interest, but he had asked questions that did not belong to simple liturgy. Questions about dedications, names removed, children who appeared once in school registers and then vanished. He had not been searching for doctrine. He had been searching for blood. The next morning, the sun broke through frost like breath on glass. The vicarage bustled in preparation for a charity breakfast, an ideal excuse, Miss Marple thought, to explore. She excused herself from the kitchen preparations and slipped once more into the vestry. There, behind the cabinet where prayer kneelers were stored, she found what she'd half expected: a second baptismal ledger, older and more fragile than the rest. Its leather binding was cracked, its ribbon marker long turned to threads. But one page was bookmarked, not with ink, but with a stain. Wax. She opened it slowly. The entry had been removed, but not entirely. A faint indent remained, pressured letters beneath, where ink had once sat. She held the page gently under the window light and angled the book until shadow gave shape to what ink had abandoned. Child R.E.D. Born February 1st, 1911. Mother Isolde. Father unlisted. There was no priest signature, no official mark, but the wax had been used to cover the page, not as preservation, as erasure. Downstairs, she heard the rattle of teacups and laughter. Life resumed its rhythm above a buried name. She stepped into the hallway just as Mrs. Drake, the widow with eyes too quiet for comfort, entered with a tin of scones. Her face paled slightly at the sight of Miss Marple holding the old ledger. "Oh, I was just tidying," Miss Marple said with a kind smile. "Your husband, Edward Drake. He was curate here before the war, wasn't he?" Mrs. Drake's fingers tightened slightly around the tin. "Yes, long ago. I only ask," Miss Marple continued gently, "because his name seems to have returned, in another form." A pause. Then, very softly, Mrs. Drake whispered, "I thought I saw it in his eyes. The boy, the new curate." "Richard Clayole," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Drake gave a broken nod. He had the same quiet sadness, the same way of looking at the altar, as if waiting for it to speak back. "Did your husband ever speak of a child?" Miss Marple asked. "No," the answer came quickly, too quickly. "But there was a time he disappeared, just before he enlisted. A few months. He said he went to visit a dying cousin, but he came back different, and he carried a photograph in his wallet, one I was never allowed to see." Miss Marple took her hand gently. "The truth, I believe, is finally speaking, not to accuse, but to be heard." And outside, the chapel bell gave a single, unexpected toll, a sound like a memory rising, or a name being called once more after long silence. It was just after twilight when Miss Marple stood alone in the north corridor of the vicarage, staring at a narrow wooden door that bore no name, no keyhole, and no welcome. For weeks she had passed by this door unnoticed, just another quiet relic in a house filled with time's furnishings. But now, after the revelations of the old baptismal ledger and Mrs. Drake's trembling confession, it no longer looked like part of the wallpaper. It looked like omission made visible. Used to be the curate's quarters, that one, the sexton had told her earlier that day. Hasn't been opened since young Clayole passed. Miss Marple pressed her palm gently against the wood. It gave way without resistance. It had never been locked. Inside, the air was still and clung to the scent of something not quite gone. Wax, faded ink, the barest trace of tobacco. The room was simple, narrow bed, writing desk, bookshelf, but what it lacked in furnishings, it compensated for in ghosts. A shawl still hung behind the door. A book lay open on the bedside table. The page it rested on held a prayer in Latin, but beneath it, in a different hand, were scrawled 3 words. "Where do names go?" Miss Marple sat gently on the edge of the bed. Her eyes scanned the room, drawn not to the obvious, but to the absences. The drawer left slightly ajar, the photograph frame missing from the dust-marked wall. She moved to the desk and opened its top drawer. Inside were only 2 things, a dry fountain pen and a folded page torn from a diary. The handwriting was unmistakably Richard's. I have seen the name again. Read in the vestry book. It matches what I found in the journal Isolde kept. I believe Edward Drake was my father. But why the silence? Why was I given away? Why am I being watched? Miss Marple paused. Watched. The thought settled cold. From the hallway came a soft creak. No more than a house settling. But she rose nonetheless, tucking the page into her sleeve. Before she stepped out, her gaze lingered once more on the shelf above the desk. A book sat slightly out of alignment, Ecclesiastical Duties and Ethics, Volume 2. She pulled it gently. A slip of paper fluttered to the floor. It was a baptism certificate, faded, unsigned, half-burned at one corner. Name, Richard Edward Clayole. Mother, Isolde. Father, name removed. Miss Marple's lips pressed together in a line. This was not absence by accident. It was careful omission, and it was unraveling now, thread by thread. Outside the window, the village was wrapped in shadow, but the chapel bell gave a faint chime, unprompted by any hand. The air shifted, just slightly, like the vicarage itself had exhaled after a long silence. Miss Marple returned to her own room and placed the certificate beside the entry from the ledger, aligning them like matching pieces of an old tapestry. If Richard had begun to connect the threads, then so had someone else. Someone who feared what would be revealed if the tapestry was completed. And now Miss Marple, with her soft voice and steady hand, would do what the others had tried to stop. She would finish it. By the time Miss Marple rose the next morning, the sky was a pale, damp sheet of linen gray, clouded, silent, and heavy with that kind of weather that seems to hush the village more than rain itself. She moved with purpose, the scent of old parchment still clinging to her thoughts. The room she had uncovered, Richard's quarters, had spoken in silence, in omissions more than in answers. But today, she intended to find something that spoke plainly. She arrived at St. Simon's Chapel just after Matins. The vicar was absent, called away to a nearby parish. The timing suited her perfectly. Miss Marple wasn't here for conversation. Instead, she walked past the pews, past the altar rail, and finally to the rear of the nave, where a row of brass plates marked the memorial stones of benefactors long buried. Her gloved fingers traced the edge of the farthest plaque, one that bore no inscription, just a space once filled, then emptied. She knew what name had belonged there. Edward Drake. Just beneath the stained-glass window of St. Michael's stood a tall, tarnished urn used for storing votive candles. It hadn't been touched in weeks, until now. Miss Marple leaned slightly and reached inside. Her fingers found what she had suspected, a curled envelope, dry but sooty, hidden beneath a layer of cold wax flakes. She withdrew it gently. The handwriting was rigid but familiar, slanted with a discipline born from clerical training. The envelope was sealed with black wax. No name, no date. She cracked it open. Inside was a single page. To the one who seeks, I ask forgiveness not from the church, but from the boy who never knew my name. I should have claimed him, but I was afraid. They told me silence was mercy, that truth would shame the cloth. I watched from the edge of each ear, hoping he would not come looking. But he did, and he found the edge of the truth. If he has gone now, it is because of me, and those who made me silence myself. May the record forgive what the church could not. No signature, no address, but Miss Marple knew whose hand had written it. Edward Drake, a father not publicly acknowledged, privately ashamed, and perhaps privately broken. She folded the letter, her fingers cold, her heart heavy. It wasn't merely confession. It was the beginning of a map. Outside the chapel, near the far hedge of the cemetery, something caught her eye. A small circle of scorched grass, oddly shaped, almost as if a lantern had been placed there and left too long. She walked toward it. Resting just beyond, half sunk into the earth, was a brass lid, curved and polished, with a single fingerprint etched in soot. Someone had burned something here. Recently. Miss Marple stared at it quietly. A letter to conceal, or the remnants of something Richard had tried to reveal? She turned slowly. The village lane before her hushed and unknowing, but her mind was no longer wandering. It was narrowing, threading through timelines, paper trails, whispers, and inheritance. Richard had not been digging in vain, and someone, maybe more than one, had gone to great lengths to make sure his search would end in sleep. But sleep, she thought, can be disturbed. Miss Marple walked back toward the vicarage, the folded page tucked inside her sleeve, her step steady. The truth had been buried. Now it would be unearthed, one grave detail at a time. The fog returned that evening, soft and low like breath upon a mirror, folding gently over Chipping Dean, as if trying to conceal what had already begun to stir. In the hush that followed evensong, Miss Marple walked the path behind St. Simon's, a wicker lantern swinging lightly in her hand. She was not, strictly speaking, expected anywhere, but she was being drawn. Not by instinct alone, but by a name left off a ledger, a plaque removed, a letter sealed too late to change the outcome. At the far edge of the churchyard, beyond the wrought iron fence where ivy choked the rusted bars, was a section older than the rest, where stones leaned as though in whispered conversation, and names faded not from time, but from deliberate neglect. This, she knew, was the part of the churchyard not walked unless one had a reason. Miss Marple paused before the oldest row and adjusted her shawl. Then, guided only by memory and intuition, she turned left and counted 6 steps from the split headstone bearing the Ashford family crest. The ground here was uneven, patched with moss and pockets of low heather. And there it was, a slight dip, not quite a grave, not quite nothing. She knelt, gently brushing away the topsoil. Her lantern cast a low golden arc across what appeared to be a stone border, unmarked, unpolished, and intentionally left blank. A shallow grave. She pressed her gloved hand against the soil. It was loose. Not fresh, but certainly disturbed. Someone had come here not long ago. Behind her, the faintest rustle. Not wind. Footsteps. But when she turned, the path was empty. She did not rise. Instead, she withdrew a small brass trowel from her coat pocket and carefully began scraping at the edge of a stone. Then her fingers caught something. Cloth. Frayed linen, once white, wrapped around what felt like a case. Metal. Rectangular. She pulled gently, slowly, as though lifting memory itself from the grave. It was a tin box. Not large, like the kind used for keepsakes during the war. She carried it back to the vicarage, tucked beneath her coat. Inside, by the quiet firelight of her guest room, Miss Marple opened the lid. Inside were 3 items. The first, a small lock of auburn hair, tied with navy ribbon. The second, a baptismal slip, creased and almost translucent from wear. It read, Richard Edward, born 1911. Mother, I.A. unmarried. Father, E.D. There was no church seal. No official stamp. But it had been real once, before being struck from the record. And the third item was a faded photograph. The same woman from the frame Richard had once kept as sold, now identified by the cursive note scrawled on the back. To my son, for the day he asks. Miss Marple's hand lingered on the photo. Her breath held. So this was the truth. Not only had Richard been born of Edward Drake and Isolde Ashcombe, he had been quietly buried by omission. The Drake family had erased the record, transferred the child to an orphanage, and tied inheritance in such a way that silence became necessary for survival. The hair, the document, the photograph, they weren't mementos. They were proof. Richard had uncovered enough of the puzzle to come close. Too close. Someone had tried to stop him from reaching the rest. And now Miss Marple, with the final piece in her lap, knew what that meant. The grave had been hidden not to bury a body, but to bury a name. But names, she thought, are like seeds. They grow back when you least expect them to. And tomorrow, she would begin asking questions, this time not softly, because justice, even quiet justice, still needed a voice. The next morning unfolded beneath a sky of pale pearl, the kind that offers no opinion of whether rain will fall or the day will simply remain undecided. Miss Marple sat at breakfast with her tea growing cool, her eyes not on the toast before her, but on the window, on the shifting curtain of mist that had begun to creep across the rectory garden once again. She had made her decision. Today would not be for subtle observations or half-glimpsed truths. Today, she would knock on doors not with politeness, but with purpose. Her first visit was to the widow, Mrs. Emmeline Drake. The house stood quietly as always, its windows drawn, and its garden bare but tidy, like a woman still grieving, but determined to keep up appearances. Mrs. Drake opened the door with the calm restraint of someone who expected a charitable visit, not a reckoning. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice thin but pleasant, "you've come to see if I've eaten. That's very kind." "I've come," Miss Marple replied gently, "to ask about Richard, and about Edward, and about the photograph you once kept hidden in the drawer behind the sideboard." Mrs. Drake blinked slowly, as though a curtain had shifted in her mind. Miss Marple stepped inside without being asked. The sitting room smelled faintly of old rosewater and wood smoke. The fire had not been lit, but the hearth was clean, swept that very morning. Miss Marple sat, setting her handbag beside her. "There's no judgment here," she began. "Only clarity. Richard was your nephew, the son of your brother Edward, and of Isolde Ashcombe. He never knew you by name, but he knew your face. He saw you weep once, in the third pew, after a sermon on sacrifice. That was when he knew you belonged to him." For a long moment, there was no reply. Then Mrs. Drake's voice emerged, quiet, strangled, full of decades. "I was 21 when it happened. My brother was 23. The war had changed him, made him softer in ways, harder in others. He came home one Christmas with a girl. Not a fiancée, not a wife. Just a girl. Beautiful, fragile, and utterly in love with him. Her name was Isolde." Miss Marple folded her hands and listened. She was wrong for him, they said. Wrong class. Wrong timing. Wrong religion. Everything about her made our father furious. When she fell pregnant, there was talk of sending her to a cousin in Wales. She refused. And Edward, to his shame, didn't resist as he might have. She was taken away. I never saw her again. What happened to the child? Miss Marple asked softly. I don't know where they placed him. Just that our father gave money, generous donations to a church-run orphanage, and said the matter was closed. When Edward died of pneumonia 2 years later, I begged to have the child's name added to the family papers. Frederick, our eldest brother, refused. Said it would complicate inheritance. And it did. It would have undone everything he'd built. So the name was erased. Miss Marple reached into her bag and withdrew the baptism slip, the lock of hair, the photograph. She laid them gently on the table. Mrs. Drake's lips trembled as she looked down. I never stopped wondering what became of him, she whispered. And then one day, this young man arrived in the parish, with Edward's eyes, with a soul's gentleness. I knew. The moment he handed me a cup of tea after choir practice, I knew. Why didn't you speak? Mrs. Drake shook her head. Because by then it was too late. Frederick was gone, but his lies had rooted too deep. The property, the titles, the money. It all depended on Edward having no heir. To name Richard would have meant unraveling everything. And he never asked. He only looked, and smiled when he found little traces. I thought that might be enough. Miss Marple looked directly at her now. He did ask Mrs. Drake. In the archives. In the parish records. In his own quiet way. He asked with every breath. And someone thought the asking itself was too dangerous. Mrs. Drake sat back, her hands now pale fists in her lap. I never heard him, she said, her voice breaking. But someone did. Someone who feared what he was about to find. Miss Marple stood slowly. Then it's time to finish what Richard began, she said. The records may be faded. The ledgers may be burned. But the truth still lives. Outside, the mist had thinned just enough to let through the first rays of a waiting sun. The morning air carried the scent of damp parchment and coal smoke, as though the village itself had stirred uneasily from a night filled with half-formed dreams. Miss Marple walked with deliberate care to the vestry, an old, narrow structure tucked behind the church, where parish records rested in their solemn, dust-covered slumber. She had arranged, through polite insistence, to be left undisturbed. The Reverend had handed her the keys without comment, though his hands had trembled as he did so. Inside, the dim light pooled in gray puddles along the stone floor. Files sat neatly in drawers and pigeonholes. But Miss Marple had no intention of looking where things were meant to be. She had long known that secrets rarely lie in plain sight. They hide in the folds, in what is missing, or oddly preserved. And one cabinet, marked plainly, 1910 to 1920, held a drawer with scorch marks along the edges. It had not been burned. It had been made to appear as if it had. She drew it open carefully. Inside, most of the ledgers were intact. One, however, a slim, leather-bound volume, was warped at the spine, its outer pages blackened and curling, but its core surprisingly unscathed. She opened it to the spring of 1911. A familiar curl of handwriting met her gaze. Richard Edward Clayle, no, not quite. The name had once read Richard Edward Drake. But the surname had been overwritten, erased beneath fresh ink. Not destroyed, only veiled. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. Not out of relief. Out of certainty. The child had been baptized quietly, with only initials noted for the mother. Isolde Ashcombe. There had been no formal godparents, no ceremonial blessing, no mention in the weekly notice. A child hidden within plain church record. One page behind, another entry, written in a similar hand, had been scratched out completely, though faint impressions remained. She traced the pressure marks lightly with her fingers, revealing part of a phrase. Father declined to sign. Outside the vestry window, a robin chirped, its song hesitant, like someone remembering the words too late. She tucked the volume carefully into her satchel and locked the drawer again. That afternoon, she returned to the vicarage. Reverend Pritchard was seated before the fireplace, his face lined with the weariness of someone who had inherited more than just sermons. I believe, Miss Marple began softly, you knew what was buried, not just in the graveyard, but in the archives. The vicar looked up slowly. "It wasn't my decision," he murmured. "I came long after. But yes, I saw the name once. Drake. I knew what it meant. I was told it was a clerical error, and I let that explanation stand." "It was never your burden to create the lie," she said, "but you became its caretaker." He nodded once. "And now we must restore the record, not out of duty to the living, but to the dead." Richard's only mistake was daring to seek what he already carried within him. Miss Marple rose. "Truth is not loud, Reverend," she said gently, "but it waits." Later that evening, the bells rang across Chipping Dean. Not for Mass, not for mourning, but simply because it was Thursday, and the hour required it. Villagers paused mid-task, hearing something in the tone they could not quite name. A soft shift, a balancing of something long left uneven, and in the vestry window, a candle now burned where none had flickered in years. It illuminated the desk, and the ledger newly opened upon it. The sky above Chipping Dean had turned a deep pewter, as if the heavens themselves held breath. In the vicarage drawing-room, a hush had settled, not the silence of absence, but of something waiting to be spoken. Miss Marple sat by the fireplace, her knitting untouched beside her, her gaze fixed not on anyone, but on everything. Before her sat Reverend Pritchard, his collar loose and eyes shadowed. Beside him, Mrs. Emmeline Drake, stiff-backed and trembling. In the far corner, Mr. Wetherby leaned forward with a furrowed brow, hands folded tightly. And near the door, as though unsure whether to stay or flee, stood Mrs. Dunning, her expression unreadable save for the faint tremor in her jaw. Miss Marple did not speak at once. She allowed the fire to crackle, the clock to tick, the weight of what they had all chosen not to say to grow unbearable. "It's time," she said finally, her voice soft but anchored, not for blame, not for shame, but for truth. No one interrupted. They knew, somehow, that interruption would not save them now. "Richard Edward Clayole," she began, "did not arrive in Chipping Dean by accident. He came because a name in the Candlemas records whispered to him. A child unnamed, born of silence, baptized beneath ink that was later scratched away. He followed it like one follows smoke, knowing there must be a fire at the heart of it." Her gaze drifted to Mrs. Drake. "He saw you during evensong, and something in him recognized what had been taken. He saw his father in your brother. He saw, perhaps for the first time, what it means to belong." Mrs. Drake's voice cracked. I knew the moment I heard him speak from the pulpit. His cadence, the way he paused before Scripture. It was Edward all over again." She lowered her head. "But how could I say anything? The family had closed the door long ago. They said a soul had lied, that the child wasn't his. But I knew. I always knew." Miss Marple nodded gently, and so did Richard. Or at least, he felt it. Enough to begin digging. She turned now to Mr. Wetherby. "You were his confidant, a link to his past." He looked up slowly. "I never admitted it, but I knew who he was. The photograph, the music box, it was all too precise. He was kind, clever, and he had that longing, like someone always standing just outside a closed door. I couldn't bear to tell him that the house behind it no longer existed." Miss Marple's expression didn't soften, but her voice did, and yet it was Mrs. Dunning who had the keys. At last the woman moved, just barely. Her lips parted, but no sound came. "You maintained the vestry. You filed the records. You were there when the edits were made. And when Richard came too close, you tried to stop him, not out of hatred, but out of fear. Because if he proved who he was, the entire legacy your late husband inherited would begin to crumble." Mrs. Dunning's hands clutched at her skirt. "I didn't mean to harm him," she whispered. "I wrote the letter to frighten him, to send him away. But he didn't stop. He kept asking, smiling, always so kind. I thought if I just made him sleep, he'd forget. He'd go." Miss Marple exhaled, deeply, but the dose was wrong. There was no denial, only silence. Reverend Pritchard leaned forward, his voice hoarse. "We all knew pieces, but none of us acted, and now he's gone." "No," Miss Marple said firmly. "He is not gone. Not in truth. The Candlemas records are being restored. his name will be entered again correctly. And tomorrow, at Vespers, there will be a candle lit in his memory, not as Cleole, but as Richard Edward Drake. The room was quiet, and yet something had changed. Not grief, not yet, but space for something like it. Miss Marple stood, reaching into her bag. She laid a folded parchment on the table, the baptismal record, with the ink now lifted by careful hands, and beside it, a small black and white photograph of a boy no older than 8, with unreadable eyes. The back read only, to Isolde. May he always know he was loved. Outside, the evening bells began to chime. 1, 2, 3. Richard's hour. The morning of Candlemas dawned soft and gray, with a light mist clinging to the stone walls of Chipping Dean, like breath too afraid to settle. Inside St. Simon's, the air was thick with the scent of beeswax and white lilies. The villagers had gathered, quiet, reverent, and unsure whether they had come for a service, a reckoning, or something older than both. Miss Marple sat in her usual pew near the aisle, her gloves neatly folded in her lap. She was not dressed in mourning, though the color of her coat was the blue-gray of fading memory. Reverend Pritchard moved slowly through the liturgy, his voice unsteady but measured. The usual readings were set aside. Instead, a name was spoken aloud for the first time, not whispered behind doors, not scratched into the margins of a hidden book, but given shape and light and word. Richard Edward Drake, child of grace, born into silence and now remembered. A single candle had been set apart at the front of the altar, taller than the rest, encased in clear glass, and bound with a thin black ribbon. The sanctuary light, rededicated, pure. It was the same candle that had once burned faintly in Richard's chambers, but today it burned with purpose. Mrs. Dunning was not present. She had gone willingly 2 days before, quietly, with no resistance. No trial had been called yet. Miss Marple doubted there ever would be one. The truth had been spoken, and sometimes justice did not wear robes or gavels, but a name returned to paper and a breath exhaled after years of holding it in. Mrs. Drake sat in the front row, a small photo of her brother tucked in her gloved hand. She had come alone. No family remained now, only this name, and what it had cost to reclaim it. After the service, the villagers gathered outside the chapel beneath low, weeping skies. The vicar led them to the churchyard, where a modest plaque had been placed beneath the yew tree, beside the older stones. Richard Edward Drake, 1911 to 1955. Known at last. No sermon was offered, only silence, and the wind stirring softly through the grass. Miss Marple lingered as the others dispersed, her gaze fixed not on the name carved in stone, but on the empty space beside it, wide enough for a second. Perhaps someday another name would be placed there. Isolde's, the woman who had carried him, lost unnamed, yet still the source of all this truth. As she turned to leave, she felt something brush her sleeve. A small boy, Peter, from the schoolhouse. He looked up at her with solemn eyes and pointed toward the candle still glowing behind the chapel window. "It's still burning," he said. "Yes," she replied softly. "Some lights take longer to go out." She walked home alone, her steps slow, her thoughts not burdened but full, like a drawer finally closed after years of disuse. At her cottage, she lit a single lamp in the front window, just as dusk crept down the village lanes. Her knitting remained untouched on the armchair. Instead, she sat and watched the flame flicker behind the glass. In Chipping Dean, people would go on with their lives. The church roof would still need patching. The vicarage cat would still sneak into the vestry. And perhaps, when the next Candlemas came, another name might be spoken, another truth laid bare. But for now, one had been enough. Richard's name no longer sat in shadow. It stood in light.